In my previous life, the only lesson my husband George Carter ever taught me was how to yield. Because I was the sister-in-law, he demanded I step aside again and again, as if sacrifice were the only virtue expected of me. When his younger brother passed away, he told me to give way, and so the one who followed him to work outside the home was not me, but Heather Turner, his widowed sister-in-law. Years later, when our children had grown, he repeated the same cold command: yield. Because of George, Heather's 2 children secured stable government jobs with enviable benefits. Every month they enjoyed steady paychecks, pensions, and the best health coverage available, while my own children bent their backs over the fields under the blistering Texas sun, earning pennies with sweat-soaked shirts and futures dimmed before they had even begun. My son looked at me with quiet resentment, torn between blaming me for failing to keep his father's heart and scorning me for bowing so low before Heather, swallowing humiliation as if that were my only duty. Even on my 80th birthday, when my frail body longed for nothing more than the company of family, they all forgot me. They remembered her, though. They gathered around Heather with gifts and laughter, throwing her a grand celebration while I sat alone, forgotten in my own home. Rage and grief surged so violently that I stumbled into the banquet trembling with indignation and knocked the table over. As the dishes shattered, my chest clenched in agony. I collapsed, my last sight in that life, nothing but the crowd rushing to shield Heather, terrified she might be disturbed while I lay abandoned, gasping my final breaths. In that moment, unwillingness burned brighter than pain. If life offered me another chance, I swore I would not cling, I would not beg, I would not yield. George Carter, I would surrender you to her entirely. When I woke again, it was not in death, but in the past, standing in front of the post office in our small Texas town. The morning air was sharp, and my palms were damp with anticipation as I waited. I had stood outside for 3 long hours, heart pounding, because I knew what was coming. The moment the doors opened, I rushed inside. My voice unsteady as I asked the clerk if there was a registered letter for Julia Carter. My hands trembled so hard they ached, but when the man asked me to sign, I forced my name across the page in neat, deliberate strokes, as if anchoring myself to the second chance. I clutched the envelope to my chest and hurried home. The sound of small feet pattered against the worn floorboards. "Mommy, I'm hungry," my little girl Emily, barely taller than my knees, wrapped her arms around my legs. My heart tightened at the sight of her pale cheeks, her thin frame. Without a word, I went to the kitchen and steamed an egg custard for her, watching as she devoured it eagerly. That month, George had already sent all of our food stamps and welfare checks across the fence to Heather's household, leaving me with almost nothing to feed my children. To him, Heather and her children were the ones who mattered. To him, Emily and Michael might as well not exist. I knew the envelope in my hand contained more than paper. Inside was a chance. Professor William Harris had written to me inviting me to join the National Frontier Research Program in New Mexico, a project that trained young people to serve in frontier towns, a path that opened doors to a brighter future. In my past life, I had received this very letter. In my past life, I had torn it to pieces. Under George's command, believing I had no right to dream of a life of my own. 10 days later, he returned home and demanded that I yield again. He reminded me of his brother's sacrifice, of how his brother had worked himself into an early grave to pay George's way through school. He claimed it was a debt he owed to Heather's family, and because he owed it, I owed it too. He said I was strong and dependable, that he could trust me to stay behind and care for our children and his aging mother. Heather, on the other hand, was weak, fragile, raising 2 children on her own. She needed him so he would take her along to work while I bore the weight of the household alone. I remember the shock I felt at his words, the way my protests tangled in my throat until they became silence. With time, his manipulation wrapped around me like chains, convincing me that obedience was love, that endurance was honor, that sacrifice was duty. I believed him. I believed until I became a shadow, a fool raising my children in poverty while he built another life with another woman. At first, George sent money and food stamps home, or so I thought. I struggled, but I managed clinging to those meager allowances. Eventually, even those dried up. Letters stopped arriving, remittances disappeared. I lived on scraps, convinced he had forgotten us. It was only years later that the truth surfaced. George had handed every paycheck, every food stamp, every welfare check to Heather. He claimed she was too modest to spend on herself, so he entrusted her with all of it, asking her to pass some along to me. In the beginning, she sent small amounts enough to keep me alive. But soon she grew bolder, swallowing everything, never passing me a cent. When I confronted her years later, she smiled faintly and said, "It must have gotten lost." That was her excuse for stealing years of my children's meals, for watching us starve, while she and her children feasted. And George, when I told him, he merely waved his hand, dismissing it as nothing worth fighting over. By then, he had poured all his strength into Heather's children, lifting them into secure jobs and stable futures. My son Michael could not even break into a clerk's position at a state office, while her son and daughter thrived. My daughter Emily dropped out of school, her body frail from years of malnutrition forced into an early marriage. My children lived lives of scarcity, while Heather's lived in comfort, basking in the privileges that should have belonged to us. That was the story of my first life, a tale of yielding until there was nothing left of me. But this time I held the letter, closed my eyes, burning with a fire I had not felt in decades. This time I would not yield. This time I would seize the chance. This time I would not let George Carter or Heather Turner dictate the fate of my children or myself. My daughter Emily grew up frail from hunger and hand-me-down clothes, her body too weak to endure the years of schooling every child deserves. She never made it through high school. Instead, she was forced to marry young, her childhood stolen by the poverty that clung to us like a curse. My children lived lives chained to hardship, condemned to labor and obscurity, while Heather Turner's children walked into comfortable futures, as if doors had always been waiting to open for them. They graduated, they secured government jobs, they retired with pensions that carried them into old age with security and grace. My children, meanwhile, carried nothing but resentment. They looked at me as if I had been the architect of their misery, blaming me for my weakness, for my silence, for my willingness to bow my head to Heather's household, hoping that crumbs of kindness might keep us alive a little longer. And so when the day of my death finally came, not one of them stood by my bedside. Not a son, not a daughter, not even a grandchild. I closed my eyes alone, the bitterness of abandonment still sharp on my tongue. But the world had its strange mercies, for when I opened them again, I had been returned. This time, I knew what to do. In my previous life, it had been just days after I received Professor William Harris's letter, the invitation that could have rewritten my entire destiny, when George Carter returned. He had barely set down his suitcase before announcing that he would take Heather with him on his next assignment, insisting that I be understanding and know my place. He left me with 2 small children and his elderly mother to care for, shouldering me with burdens that belonged to us both, while he walked away with another woman, under the guise of obligation. Out of misplaced loyalty, I tore up the letter that could have changed everything. That decision was the scar I carried to my grave, a regret that festered and haunted me until my final breath. But not this time. This time I held the letter to my chest, running my fingers over the seal as if to draw strength from its promise. My eyes burned not with despair, but with determination. I would not make the same mistake again. This time I would pack my bags. I would seize this chance, and I would repay George Carter and Heather Turner for every humiliation and every ounce of blood they had stolen from me and my children. If George wanted to take her and her children along, he could dream of it in vain. He would never drag me into that farce again. I gathered my belongings quickly, moving through the house with a calm born of steel. I lifted Emily into my arms, her small frame warm against me, and stepped out into the Texas sun. The path to Heather's house was short, but each step felt like the beating of a war drum. By the time I reached her yard, the scent of meat hit me like a blow. Rich, savory, undeniable. My fist clenched. How could a widow with no steady income, no job, no means of her own live with such ease, eat meat, as often as she pleased, wear new clothes like a lady of leisure? The answer was clear. It was the fruit of George's labor siphoned from the mouths of my children to fatten hers. In my past life, I told myself that George's guilt toward his late brother justified the endless flow of money and food stamps that went across that fence. I told myself I had to bear the debt alongside him. Each time he handed over what belonged to us, I swallowed my outrage. Reminding myself that a debt was a debt, even if it crushed me, I thought silence was nobility. But what did silence bring me? Nothing but decades of misery. Heather and George lived in comfort while I raised my children on scraps, watching them grow sickly and bitter. I tightened my hold on Emily and walked toward the group of women gathered at the end of the block. Heather was there smiling as if she were the picture of grace, her voice sweet as she gossiped with our neighbors. She wore a crisp new blouse of synthetic fibers, a pressed pair of black slacks, and a glittering bow clipped neatly in her hair. To anyone who didn't know better, she could have passed for a schoolteacher. But I knew better. I knew the truth. When her eyes fell on me, she froze for an instant before forcing a smile. Once I might have returned it. Once I might have turned away muttering some excuse. But now I felt nothing but a hatred so deep it seemed carved into my bones. Heather had clung to George like ivy, strangling everything that was mine, feeding off the life that belonged to my family. Even she must have sensed it, for though our houses stood side by side, we had spoken little in the past life, as if some unspoken tension kept us apart. The other women greeted me warmly, but their smiles faltered as they noticed the coldness in my stare. "Julia, what's wrong?" one of them asked. "Why are you looking at Heather like that?" another whispered. I pressed my lips together, then let my eyes lock with Heather's. My voice cut through the warm Texas air like ice. "George Carter sent you our food stamps again, didn't he?" Heather's face drained of color, her forced smile trembling. "Sister, no, of course not," she stammered, her words tumbling out too fast. The neighbors turned to her with wide eyes, suspicion already stirring. I did not soften. I stepped closer, my voice sharp as broken glass. "It has been 2 months since my family has had a piece of meat on our table. And yet today, walking past your house, I smelled stew so rich it could have fed a dozen mouths." "Tell me Heather did?" "George send you the stamps again?" She waved her hands quickly, fumbling for excuses. No, it's not like that. I borrowed," I laughed, the sound bitter, cutting off her words. "Borrowed? How convenient. But I know better. I know there are letters too each month sent directly from George to you." "Do you deny that?" gasps rippled through the group. The women exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to outrage. Heather's lips quivered, her excuses crumbling as the truth pressed down. What I did not yet know was that George, in his twisted reasoning, thought he was sparing me embarrassment. He believed that if he sent money and stamps to me directly, Heather would feel awkward asking for help. So he gave everything to her, asking her to share it with me. For 3 years, month after month, he trusted her with the lifeline meant for us. For 3 years, she kept it all. Not once did she hand me a single cent, a single coupon, a single dollar. But in that moment, standing with my daughter in my arms, the women of our community watching Heather's lies unraveled, I would no longer be silent. I would no longer yield. This time, everything George sent, everything that belonged to me and my children, I would reclaim piece by piece, dollar by dollar, no matter who tried to stand in my way. I was the wife, the one who had vowed before God and the law to stand beside George Carter, and yet I never received so much as a single dollar of the money he sent home. Heather Turner never imagined I would find out. In her mind, I was too proud, too bound by the pitiful dignity of a wronged wife to ever lower myself to demand what was mine. She must have thought that even if the truth reached me, I would grit my teeth and swallow it, unwilling to confess that in George's heart, she outweighed me. After all, I was the lawful wife, but she was the one he cherished. That was the cruel irony, which is why my appearance at her doorstep, my direct challenge in front of neighbors, had knocked the breath out of her. It was something she had never accounted for. I did not care anymore about the sordid ties between them. Whether their nights together had been whispers or something worse was no longer my concern. What mattered was simple: what belonged to me would be returned, every last cent, every stamp, every benefit. I gave her no room to wriggle free. My voice was sharp as a blade as I declared I knew the truth, that for 3 years George had sent money and food stamps to her, and not once had she passed them on to me. Heather's lips parted, a protest forming, but I cut her off with a cold laugh. I don't care what filth lies between you and him. I said my words like ice. But the money, the stamps, they are mine. You will pay them back in full. If you try any tricks, I will go straight to the sheriff's office and report your adultery. The color drained from her face, her body swaying as if my words had struck her physically. "Julia, no, please, it's not what you think," she stammered. "Not what I think." My laugh was bitter. I stepped closer, forcing her to retreat. Not taking George's money, or not sleeping in the shadow of his loyalty to his brother. Which lie will you choose? She trembled, choking on excuses. But I had no desire to listen. My tone was final, merciless. The money and the stamps, tonight, every single one. With that, I gathered Emily in my arms and turned away, leaving Heather's desperate pleas to echo in the night air. I walked home, my steps heavy but unyielding, and set Emily down while I prepared what little we had for supper. I steamed potatoes, crushing them into small cakes to stretch the meal. Life without George was harsh, but it was survivable. To keep my children alive, I had taken a job in a small pharmacy in town, measuring herbs and wrapping medicine. Because I was literate and careful, the owner tolerated my absences when the children needed me. The pay was meager, but it was steady, and I clung to every penny. For 3 years, while George was away, I scraped together what I could, saving bit by bit, raising Michael and Emily on my own. I told myself that when George returned, he could take responsibility, that I would no longer carry it alone. Yet he had not returned. And until he did, I could not abandon my duty as a mother. Tonight, Michael was staying with his grandparents, so I set only 2 plates on the worn wooden table, one for Emily and one for me. I waited past 9, watching the doorway, expecting Heather to appear with the money and stamps she had hoarded. But no knock came, no apology, no restitution. I thought bitterly that her skin must be as thick as steel, that she would rather face scandal than admit her theft. Fine, I decided. Tomorrow I would march to the authorities myself. There would be no more mercy. Yet just after 10, the door creaked open from outside. I threw on my coat and stepped into the entryway, my pulse quickening. The sight before me froze the breath in my lungs. George stood there, younger than I remembered him, a travel-worn suitcase dangling from one hand. And beside him, smiling sweetly, as though nothing were amiss, stood Heather Turner. She glanced at me, her tone sugary. "Julia, I forgot to tell you George came home early today." Her eyes flickered nervously to his, then back to me. "Don't bother cooking. He already ate at my place." My face must have darkened, for she quickly added, tripping over her words. "It's just, Ryan hadn't seen his uncle in so long, and he clung to him, begged him to stay. George didn't want to disappoint the boy. That's all." I stood motionless, my gaze on George, saying nothing. He set down his suitcase and gave Heather's shoulder a reassuring pat, as though she were the one who needed comfort. "It's fine," he said softly. "Julia isn't petty. You should go home now. Ryan will cry if he doesn't see you." Heather hesitated, her eyes darting between us, then lowered her head and slipped out into the night. I turned toward my room, intending to shut myself away from the farce, but George's voice stopped me. "Julia, can we talk?" I paused. For a long moment, silence stretched between us. Finally, I nodded. We sat across from each other at the battered wooden table, the lamp casting weary shadows across his face. I studied him as he sat there silent, his brow furrowed, his hands folded. I thought he was searching for words of explanation, perhaps some admission of guilt. I thought foolishly that he might finally acknowledge what he had done, the years of neglect, the betrayal. But when he lifted his eyes to mine, his first words were not apology, not remorse. They were accusation. "Julia." He set his voice low and sharp. "Did you go to Heather today and cause trouble?" For a heartbeat, I could not breathe. I had expected anything but this. My chest burned with the cruel weight of his words. He who had abandoned me, who had starved our children, who had given everything to another woman, dared to look at me as if I were the one in the wrong. My lips curved into a bitter smile. So this was what my marriage was worth. This was the man I had once loved. I had been his wife, the one who bore his name and his children, yet not a single dollar ever reached my hands. Heather Turner never believed I would discover the truth. She was certain that even if I did, my pitiful pride would keep me silent, that I would rather starve in dignity than admit aloud that in George's heart I was worth less than her. I was the wife, yet she was the one he cherished. She never thought I would come to her door in broad daylight in front of the neighbors and call her out. That was a move beyond her calculations, and I saw the fear in her eyes when I did it. I no longer cared about what tied them together in the shadows. The only thing that mattered was what belonged to me. Every food stamp, every welfare check, every penny sent in George's name, I would reclaim it all. She would not be allowed to hide behind excuses anymore. I said it plainly, my voice as cold as a blade, that I knew George had been sending her money for 3 years, and that she had kept every bit of it. She tried to stammer a denial, but I cut her off. "I don't care what filth exists between you and him," I told her. "But what is mine you will return. If you dare play games, I will go to the sheriff and report the both of you for adultery." The word hit her like a stone. Her body swayed, her face pale. She tried to beg to deny, but I stepped closer, my laughter bitter. "No money from George, or no dirty dealings with him. Which lie will you choose?" Her voice faltered into silence. I left her no mercy. The money and the stamps. Tonight, every cent. I turned Emily in my arms and walked home, her frantic calls trailing uselessly behind me. Back in my kitchen, I set her down and began steaming potatoes, mashing them into cakes for dinner. Life without George was backbreaking, but I had managed. While he was gone, I worked in the small pharmacy in town, measuring herbs, packaging medicine, earning what little I could. Because I was literate and precise, the owner kept me on even when I had to leave suddenly for the children. For 3 years, I had scraped and saved every penny guarded, raising Emily and Michael as best I could. That night, I sat with Emily at the table, Michael away at his grandparents', and waited. By 9 o'clock, there was no knock at the door, no sign of Heather. I told myself her shame would not outweigh her greed, that she would not pay me back. Fine, I thought, tomorrow I will go to the authorities myself. But a little after 10, the door opened from the outside. I pulled on my coat and stepped into the entryway. There he was, George Carter, suitcase in hand, younger and stronger than the last time I had seen him. And beside him stood Heather Turner, smiling like the mistress of the house. "Julia," she said sweetly, "I forgot to tell you. George came home early today. Don't bother cooking, he already ate with us." My face must have gone dark, because she quickly rushed on her words, tumbling. "It's just Ryan hadn't seen his uncle in so long. He begged him to stay. George didn't want to disappoint the boy. That's all." I said nothing, staring at George. He set down his suitcase and gave Heather's shoulder a reassuring pat, as though she were the one needing comfort. "It's fine," he told her softly. "Julia isn't petty. You should go home now. Ryan will be crying for you." Heather glanced between us, then bowed her head and slipped out. I turned intent on retreating to my room, but George's voice stopped me. "Julia, can we talk?" For a long moment I stood still, then finally nodded. We sat at the worn wooden table, the lamplight throwing shadows across his face. He sat in silence so long I thought he might be searching for words of contrition. I thought perhaps he might finally acknowledge what he had done. But when he lifted his gaze, his first words cut deeper than silence. "Julia," he said, his voice cold. "Did you go to Heather today and cause trouble?" The words stole my breath. I had expected anything but this. My lips curved into a bitter smile. He pressed on before I could speak, his tone hard. "Do you realize what you've done, the things you said? Do you know how people will look at her now?" I laughed then, though my chest burned with rage. "You mean to say 3 years you abandoned your wife and children, left us to rot, while you fed another woman and raised her children as your own, and I am not allowed to mention it? You can do all that, but my mouth must stay shut." His face froze, the mask of composure cracking. "What other woman?" he snapped. "She is my brother's widow, she is family, and so what?" I shot back. My voice sharp. His hands clenched, his anger restrained, his tone forced into calm. "My brother worked himself to death so I could finish school. I owe them everything. It is a debt I can never repay." I looked at him and saw not the man I had once loved, but a stranger, a coward. "Yes, it is your debt. But why must I and my children pay it with you? You could have remained unmarried, shouldered that burden yourself, raised her children as your own if you wished. Or better still, divorce me now and marry Heather. There is still time. But do not drag me and my children into this endless penance of yours." I leaned forward, my voice rising with fury. "George Carter, do not be so selfish." His eyes flared, his face pale with outrage. "Julia Carter, do you even hear yourself? Divorce, marry Heather. Do you forget she is your sister-in-law?" I laughed then, the sound sharp and bitter. "Ah, so you do remember that I am only a sister-in-law. I am not your mother, nor hers. I owe you nothing, and I owe that family nothing." My voice rose higher, each word cutting like a knife. "So you married me, bore children with me, only to have one more mule to carry your brother's debts. You expect me and my children to spend our whole lives yielding, giving, sacrificing for the so-called kindness on your back. And what, not even allowed to complain?" My hands shook with fury. "Or perhaps you want me to set up an altar to your brother's family, burn incense to them every day, and worship them as saints while we starve?" George's face went white, his mouth opening and closing without words. At last he whispered, "Julia, I thought you were sensible, that you understood the bigger picture. I never imagined you would be so small-minded." The laugh that burst from me was jagged and bitter. I rose suddenly, the chair scraping across the floor, my eyes blazing. "Yes, I am small-minded. 3 years you abandoned us. 3 years you squandered everything on another woman, and you dare call yourself right?" My voice was sharp enough to cut. "If you think you are right, then fine. Tomorrow I will go to your department myself. I will speak to your superiors, and we will discuss this so-called bigger picture together." His face darkened. "Julia, I just returned. Must we quarrel already?" I sneered. "If you don't want to quarrel, it's simple. Pay me back. Every cent, every stamp from the last 3 years. If not tomorrow, I will see you at your office." With that, I turned, dragging an extra quilt into the storage room and locking the door from the inside. Let him sit outside in silence. I only wanted what was mine. As I lay down, bitterness pressed on me, but I felt strangely calm. I no longer cared when he returned, why he returned, or how Heather had known before I did. I no longer cared that he had been home for hours eating at her table while his wife and child sat hungry in the next house over. Those were pains of my past life. I had already lived the tears, the anger. This time I would live for myself. At dawn, I rose, packed what I needed, and walked to the pharmacy, where I had worked the past 3 years. The owner looked at me in surprise when I asked to resign. He tried to persuade me to stay, but when I insisted, he only sighed and nodded. Before I left, he pressed a small red envelope into my hand. "Julia, where you're going, the road is long and hard. Take care of yourself." For a moment, my throat tightened. He was a man of few words, yet his kindness nearly undid me. The pharmacy owner had always been a man of few words, stern and quiet. Yet his simple gesture of pressing that red envelope into my hand nearly broke me. His voice gentle but firm, telling me to take care of myself on the long road ahead, was enough to bring tears dangerously close to my eyes. Mountains and rivers, what did they matter? I forced a smile, hiding the sting in my chest. Just then the bell over the door chimed, and George Carter walked in. The owner glanced at him, then back at me, sensing the tension in the air. I kept my tone cool as I explained, "This is the father of my children." At that, the old man simply sighed, gave George one long look, and retreated to greet another customer. George's eyes narrowed, his brows knitting together. What were the two of you talking about? I slipped the wages and the red envelope into my pocket, refusing to answer. I walked straight out of the shop. He hurried after me, catching my wrist. "Julia," he said, his voice low and strained. "I'm sorry. These past 3 years, you've carried so much." I yanked my hand free. "And so what?" My words cut sharper than I intended. His expression faltered, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Julia, I'm sorry," he repeated, softer this time. "Maybe I failed before, maybe I didn't fulfill my responsibilities. But I swear I'll make it up to you. I'll repay you 100-fold. A laugh burst from me, cold and humorless. "Repay me how?" "By taking Heather with you, by leaving me alone in this house to grow old in solitude while you play savior to her." His eyes widened, startled that I had voiced the thought aloud. My lips curled into a bitter smile as I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "You came back this time to take Heather with you, didn't you?" The silence that followed was damning. He stammered, "Julia, what are you saying?" I stepped closer, my gaze unflinching. "I asked if you returned to take Heather Turner with you. There was no escape." His silence spoke louder than any denial. Finally, he dropped his gaze and whispered, It's not like that." Oh, I let out a laugh, sharp and mocking. "And here I thought you wouldn't be shameless enough to take your sister-in-law to live under the same roof with you." His face twisted, fury replacing guilt. "Julia, what nonsense is this? What kind of woman have you become, talking like some bitter gossip?" I met his rage with calm contempt. "So you admit it then? You truly meant to take her?" His silence again was answer enough. At last he sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Julia, you know how hard it has been for her. Heather is alone raising 2 children with nothing. My brother is gone. She is my responsibility now. You must understand." I said nothing, my face unreadable, and his desperation grew. His tone softened, coaxing, as if I were a child to be persuaded. "Julia, I know you've suffered. I know how hard it has been for you raising Michael and Emily. But just give me time. Once I'm settled, I'll send for you. We'll be together again, the whole family. Just a little more patience." From his pocket, he produced a wad of bills and food stamps, thrusting them toward me with trembling hands. "Julia, I know you're angry, but please try to understand. If I had sent the money directly to you, Heather's pride would never have allowed her to accept my help. But if I gave it to her first, she could pass it to you, and it would feel easier, less humiliating for her. I thought it was the best way. I never imagined she would keep it all." His eyes searched mine, eager for forgiveness. He pressed on, piling excuses like sandbags against a flood. "And it wasn't her fault entirely. She gave the rest to Mother to hold for you. I asked her, she thought I had sent extra, so she kept it. Julia, this was my mistake. I wasn't careful enough. Please believe me." I raised my eyes to his cold as steel. He kept talking, his voice earnest, spinning justification after justification. But I no longer listened. I knew exactly what this was, a hastily crafted play. A desperate cover to keep me silent, to keep the shame from spilling into his workplace, into the community. They thought if they joined hands, they could patch the lie well enough to hold. But nothing could erase the truth. For 3 years, he had abandoned me, left me to scrape by, while he poured everything into Heather's household. And now, fearing exposure, they worked together to paint themselves as noble, to twist their betrayal into sacrifice. I looked at him, really looked at the man who once held my trust. All I saw was ruin, a stranger wearing the face of the husband I had loved. My heart was nothing but a wasteland now. Even blood ties hadn't stopped them. His parents knew what he had done. They had seen me struggle, seen my children pale and hungry, while Heather's table overflowed. Yet they had turned away. And worse, they had defended her, propped up his deception, made me the villain. Later, when George insisted we visit his parents' home, I stepped through the doorway and saw Heather already seated inside, head bowed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The moment my mother and father-in-law looked at me, their faces hardened with disapproval. My father-in-law slammed his chopsticks against the table, the crack echoing through the room. "I heard what you're planning, Julia. Making a scene at George's office. Have you lost your mind? He works himself half to death, and you want to drag him down with gossip and shame." The words crashed over me, each one more bitter than the last. "You've lived comfortably enough in this house, haven't you?" George's father's voice cracked like a whip, his face flushed with rage. "And yet, you still want to ruin him. You would smear your husband's name, disgrace this family, and drag your sister-in-law through the mud. You may not care for your own reputation, Julia, but the Carters still have a family name to protect." His chest heaved as he leaned closer, the disdain thick in his tone. "You can't even raise your children properly. If it weren't for Heather sparing a little food for them now and then, do you think they'd still be alive and well?" For a heartbeat, I froze, struck by the sheer audacity of it. It was the kind of shamelessness that dressed itself up as righteousness, twisting filth into virtue. Heather living well off my husband's wages, feasting on meat, while my children starved, was now paraded as their benefactor, simply because she had tossed us scraps. My mother-in-law said nothing, but the coldness in her eyes was condemnation enough. And then Michael came running in from outside. My boy, my son. He charged straight at me, fists small but furious, pounding against me with all the force of his youth. "Bad mom. Don't bully Aunt Heather, bad mom. Go away." His little fist struck my body, each blow sharper than the last, not because of pain, but because of where they landed on my heart. Ryan Turner joined in, his eyes blazing with loyalty to Heather, throwing his weight behind Michael's small assault. I stood still, not lifting a hand to defend myself. Their punches rained down sharp and clumsy, and I let them. The ache was not in my skin, but in my soul. George quickly pulled the boys away, sighing as though he were the victim of it all. "Julia," he said softly, patronizingly, "you've misunderstood me, and you've misunderstood Heather. I know you're just hurt, but you need to see things clearly." He looked at me as if he were the only reasonable one in the room, as if I were a hysterical fool. "Apologize to her. She'll forgive you. She's generous. She won't hold a grudge." Heather dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, her tears glittering like well-rehearsed jewels. Her voice trembled. "Julia, I'm sorry. I know you think badly of me. I shouldn't have taken the money George gave me, but he only wanted to help because you and the children were struggling. He was just being kind." She sniffled, lowering her gaze. "Don't be angry anymore. I'll go back to my parents' house with the kids. You won't have to see me again." "No," Michael cried out, clutching at her skirt. "Don't go, Aunt Heather. I want you here, bad mom. You leave instead." His little voice broke like glass, and the room filled with his tears, his desperate wails. I looked around the cramped living room at their faces, accusing, scornful, pitying. My in-laws glaring, my husband sighing, Heather weeping beautifully. My son rejecting me with fists and words. And in that suffocating moment, I laughed. A cold, jagged laugh that cut through the air like ice. Because I remembered. I remembered that in my last life, it was in this very room that George made his choice. He had taken Heather and her children away, leaving me behind with his aging parents to care for until their deaths. I had been left to raise my own children in bitterness and poverty, only to have them grow up resentful, blaming me for everything. My life had rotted away in these walls, and even on my 80th birthday, no one remembered me. Now here I stood, and history was repeating itself. But this time, I was not the same woman. I straightened my voice, ringing clear. For 3 years, George sent 2 letters every month to Heather, each with money and food stamps. For 3 years, I lived as if I were a widow scraping by with scraps, while you all watched and said nothing. And now he has returned, not for me, not for his children, but for her. You knew it, all of you. My eyes swept over them, piercing, unflinching. You call yourselves righteous, yet you condone a man coveting his brother's widow. You wrap your shame in words of duty and honor. It is disgusting. I turned my gaze on Heather, my eyes hard as ice. You must be proud of yourself. You've stolen his heart completely. From the beginning to the end, he never thought of his wife or his children. He spent everything, his money, his time, his loyalty on you. And you so content to take it all to fatten your children on what should have been ours. My lips curved into a bitter smile as I looked at George's parents. Tell me, do you not feel filthy? Watching your son pine for the wife of the brother buried in his grave. Do you not think of the dead at all? Or are you too busy scheming to crown this as some noble love story? My father-in-law's face reddened further, but he said nothing. My mother-in-law looked away, her expression faltering, but the silence was as damning as any words. I shifted my eyes back to George, each word deliberate, heavy. Dress it up however you like. Call it loyalty, call it repayment, call it sacrifice. But the truth remains, you lust after your brother's wife. That is the truth you cannot wash away. The air in the room thickened, everyone's faces tightening, but I no longer cared. In my last life, their judgments had crushed me, had caged me. But this time I was done bending, done begging. I was not the woman they could bury beneath their lies. I turned to leave, my steps heavy with rage and sorrow, but as I passed my son, I stopped. His young eyes, wide with anger that wasn't his own, stared back at me, filled with resentment Heather had carefully planted there. I looked at him long and hard, my voice trembling yet sharp as glass. You love her so much, then let her be your mother. The words sliced through the air. Behind me, George's parents shouted in outrage, George himself calling after me, his voice frantic. But I didn't turn back. I walked out of that suffocating house, the accusations and pleas crashing against my back like waves against stone. My mind was clear. I was finished. At home, I took up the suitcase I had prepared in secret. My hands did not hesitate. This time there would be no waiting, no hoping he would choose me. With Emily clinging to my side, I stepped into the night without once looking over my shoulder. Just beyond the gate, I stumbled upon a group of elderly women gathered beneath the street lamp, their voices rising and falling in familiar gossip. When they saw me with my suitcase, they blinked in surprise. Julia, where are you going with all that? I bit down hard on my lip, but the tears came anyway, spilling down my cheeks in hot, humiliating streams. My voice broke as I whispered, Tell me, have I been wrong all these years, truly wrong? They hurried to me, concern etching their wrinkled faces. What's happened, child? Why are you crying? My sobs poured out like a flood bursting through a dam. Do you know what I learned yesterday? George came back home, my husband. And yet his wife knew nothing. Heather knew. She had a meal ready for him, waiting as if she were the one he belonged to. He returned around 5 or 6 in the evening, but I didn't lay eyes on him until nearly 10 o'clock at night. The women exchanged stunned glances. My voice cracked as I went on. For 3 years, 3 long years, he sent money and food stamps to her, twice every month. And me, his wife, I never received a single penny. Not once. Gasps rose from the small crowd, their shock quickly turning to outrage. Julia, we've seen how you've struggled these years, raising those children alone. It's a miracle you kept going at all. Their anger flared righteous and raw. I wiped at my tears, but they kept coming. my words trembling with humiliation. And now he tells me he came back for her. He wants to take Heather with him. Do you hear me? He came back for her. What? The cry rose from them all at once. Take his sister-in-law to where I laughed bitterly through my tears, the sound raw and jagged. He said she has it hard raising children alone, and he feels he must ease her burdens. That's why. An older woman slapped her thigh, her voice trembling with fury. And what about you? Does he think you've had it easy raising his children alone? What nonsense is this? I shook my head, a hollow smile on my lips. It doesn't matter anymore. Heather has already been kept well these 3 years. She's had his money, his protection, while I barely managed to keep my children alive. And his parents. They tell me I owe her, because my son once ate meat she gave him out of pity. They say I should be grateful. My voice cracked heavy with scorn. Grateful for scraps bought with my husband's wages. Murmurs rippled through the group. One woman muttered I often smelled meat cooking from Heather's kitchen, wondered how she could afford it. Another added, she told me her family sent it to her. What a lie. Shameless, another spat, fury flashing in her eyes. Stealing from George's wife and children to live in comfort, then playing the saint by tossing them scraps. God will punish such people. Mark my words. Their anger was fierce, but I had no strength to bask in their support. One of them noticed the suitcase clutched in my hand. Julia, where are you going? Tell us you're not leaving. I gave a broken laugh, shaking my head as fresh tears fell. If I leave, then he and Heather can be together openly. Isn't that what they want? What they've always wanted. The women crowded closer, their voices urgent, trying to soothe me. Oh, child, don't do this. Think of your little ones. They need their mother. They're too young, too fragile. If you're not there, who will protect them? That's right, another insisted. Endure it for their sake. Wait until they grow up. One day they'll understand the sacrifices you made. But I only shook my head, holding my suitcase tighter. My lips pressed together as my shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. Their well-meaning words bounced off the hardened shell of my heart. Because I remembered. In my last life I had endured. I had endured every humiliation, every betrayal for the sake of my children. I believed my love would be enough, that if I sacrificed myself they would see, and they would cherish me for it. But in the end they had resented me. They had turned their backs, believing Heather the saint and me the cruel mother who stood in her way. That was the lesson carved into my bones by death itself. A mother's love was not invincible. Love without power, without money, was worth nothing. I clutched Emily's small hand tighter, my heart heavy yet resolute. I would not repeat my mistakes. This time I would choose differently. For 5 years after that, I worked relentlessly every single day, never allowing myself to rest. My body bent under exhaustion, my hands rough from labor, but my spirit was steel. I would never again allow my fate to be bound to theirs. One by one, my classmates who had joined Professor William Harris's National Frontier Research Program completed their service and left. By the 4th year, even the professor himself had stepped down, but I stayed. I endured. I pushed forward, carving a place for myself in a world that had once tried to erase me. I never left. While others finished their assignments and moved on, while even Professor William Harris eventually stepped down, I stayed. I kept pushing forward, kept enduring, refusing to surrender, no matter how exhausted or broken I felt. 10 years later, my persistence was rewarded. I was selected to join a classified national project, one of the most ambitious undertakings in our country. We worked in secrecy, pouring sweat and sleepless nights into building what no one believed we could build. And then one morning it happened. The rocket our team had spent years designing roared to life and tore through the sky. I stood among the crowd watching the flames blaze upward, the earth trembling beneath our feet. My heart surged with pride so fierce it made me tremble. Every sacrifice, every lonely night, every collapse I had hidden from the world suddenly became worth it. When the project finally concluded, the government gave me a week's leave. For the first time in a decade, I returned to the small street in Texas where my old life had collapsed. The moment I stepped into the neighborhood, a group of elderly women chatting by the corner recognized me. Julia. Is that really Julia Carter? I smiled and nodded. In an instant, they rushed to surround me. Julia, where have you been all these years? We only heard rumors. Every month you sent money back, but never once did a letter arrive. Did you make it big? Their eyes traveled up and down, taking in my floral silk blouse, my pleated skirt, and the heels that clicked smartly against the pavement. To them, I must have looked like someone from the pages of a glossy magazine, not the desperate woman who had once fled this place in tears. I had dressed carefully, not for vanity, but for my children. I wanted them to see me strong, radiant, untouched by the suffering of the past. Before I could answer, I saw him. Not far away, standing stiff as though struck by lightning, George Carter stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. It had been 10 years since I walked away from him. 10 years since I sent that letter of denunciation to his office, forcing his superiors to confront his disgraceful behavior. He hadn't been ruined entirely, but his career had suffered. He was transferred out of Washington, assigned to local fieldwork, stripped of the position he had once boasted about. From then on, there was no excuse to take Heather Turner with him under the pretense of helping a widow. Mom, two voices, one small and one deeper, pierced the moment. My children, Michael and Emily, ran from the gate of my old house, throwing themselves into my arms. Their faces, though older, carried the same sweetness, and in their eyes there was no trace of distance, no shadow of the 10 years we had lost. My vision blurred as I held them close, my heart nearly breaking with the weight of joy. Every month I had sent money back, making sure half of it was spent on meat so they wouldn't go hungry. The neighbors, never wealthy themselves, had gladly helped, knowing they could feed my children and keep their own dignity intact. It seemed they had kept their promise. My children had not starved. They had grown, and they still called me mother without hesitation. After the reunion, after gifts and laughter, the crowd dispersed and the house quieted until only George and I remained in the living room. I had heard whispers before I came back. They said he never lived with Heather after I left, that their so-called relationship became a scandal, mocked and gossiped about until Heather was forced back to her parents' home. Eventually, she married another man, but her life fared no better. He despised the children she brought with her, refused to have more, and beat her so often that one day he broke her leg. She walked with a limp. Now her beauty faded into bitterness. As for George, the neighbors said he stayed behind all these years. He took care of his aging parents until they both passed last year. They said he bore it all in silence, refusing to remarry, though urged to countless times. He's waiting for Julia. They told one another, shaking their heads. A foolish man, but loyal in his own way. But they were wrong. He wasn't loyal. He was selfish. And this time, I had not come back to fall into his waiting arms. I had come back to end it. When he saw me sitting there, he nearly glowed with joy, bustling about like a man possessed. He hurried to the market, returning with bags full of groceries, insisting on preparing a feast. We'll celebrate Julia. A family reunion like old times, he said, his eyes bright with hope. I sat quietly at the table, watching him move around the kitchen with uncharacteristic eagerness. But instead of warmth, a bone-deep weariness settled in my chest. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, he dodged, changing the subject, hiding behind busyness and laughter. By the time the meal was ready, Michael and Emily were already seated, smiling, their faces glowing in the light. George beamed as though he had finally rebuilt what he once destroyed. We ate together, laughter bouncing off the old walls, but I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me. When the dishes were cleared, when the night grew still, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I looked at him, his face softened by time, but still achingly familiar, and I felt nothing but exhaustion. George, I said quietly, my voice firm as steel beneath silk. We need to talk. He froze, the smile slipping from his face. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly he sat down across from me. and I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. When the dishes were cleared away, George looked at me with a hopeful tenderness that almost seemed genuine. "I've prepared a room for you," he said softly. "Take a shower and get some rest." He started to rise as if the evening could close in peaceful silence, but I stopped him. "Sit down," I said. My voice was calm, steady with a firmness that could not be mistaken. He froze for a moment, then slowly obeyed. I raised my eyes and met his. "George, we need to divorce." The words fell between us like a stone sinking in deep water. I should have said them 10 years ago when my heart was still raw and bleeding. But back then I couldn't let go. Back then I feared giving him the freedom to marry Heather Turner. The idea of him walking away to embrace her openly had been unbearable. I thought it would take endless battles to drag his signature onto those papers. Now the weight in my chest was gone. I no longer needed to fight. The decision was final. That night I stayed under the same roof, not because of him, but for my children. They were mine by blood, and even if in another life they had turned against me, I still owed them these final hours together. The next morning we went to the courthouse. The process was simple, brisk, merciless. The clerk stamped the papers, and just like that, our years of marriage dissolved into ink and dust. As I picked up my suitcase and turned to leave, he called after me, his voice breaking. "Julia." I turned only briefly. At the corners of his eyes, tears glistened. His voice trembled. "I'm sorry, in our last life together, those words had never come until the very end when I lay dying. But now he had spoken them while we were still breathing the same air. Too late, yes, but still." I accepted them with a weary nod. From that moment forward, I gave everything to my work. My career became my life, my anchor, my redemption. 8 years passed in a blur of laboratories' data and steel corridors filled with the hum of machinery. Then one day my son sent me a message. He was getting married and he asked if I would attend. My heart leapt. I said yes without hesitation. At the wedding, he and his young bride stood proudly before the crowd. When it was time for speeches, he lifted the microphone with tears shining in his eyes. "This is my mother," he declared. "She is an extraordinary woman, and we are proud to call her ours." At that very moment, the banquet hall's large screen flickered to life, showing a replay of an interview with the research team from the National Aerospace Research Institute. My face filled the screen as I spoke about our mission, our sacrifices, and the dream that had lifted us into the sky. The entire hall turned to look at me, their gazes filled with awe and admiration. My children stood on either side, their eyes bright with pride and emotion, as if seeing me for the first time, not only as their mother, but as the woman I had fought to become. Across the room, my gaze drifted almost by accident and landed on George. The man who had once ruled my world now sat small, diminished, stripped of the arrogance he once wore like armor. In our past life, he had soared because of me, his career climbing on the wings I secretly lent him. He had lived surrounded by comfort and beauty, flattered by the presence of another woman at his side, basking in the illusion of triumph. But in this life without me, his wings had been cut. He stumbled, fell, and never rose again. It wasn't only my absence that doomed him, but also the judgment of his own children and the coldness of his aging parents. For years after our divorce, he had carried the burden of raising Heather's children, yet found no partner willing to stand beside him. His health failed. His strength waned. He was forced into early retirement, never even reaching the lowly position of department head. Meanwhile, my children flourished. With the education I funded and the homes I gifted them, when they married, they built lives of prosperity and joy. Each one graduated from prestigious universities. Each one found love and built families of their own. Though I had not always been at their side in their hearts, I remained untarnished, the mother who had given everything she could. They pitied their father. They resented him. They told me more than once, if only he had not betrayed you, maybe we would have grown up with both parents. Maybe your life would have been less lonely. George tried to defend himself, claiming he had never cheated. But the neighbors remembered. They remembered the whispers the money funneled away, the shameful favoritism. They retold it to my children again and again, and the truth lodged itself deep, immovable. When my children each married, they invited me into their homes, begged me to live with them. They promised care, warmth, devotion. But I refused. I had spent too many years shackled by obligation. Now, in the twilight of my life, I wanted freedom. I had earned it. I wanted mornings of silence, afternoons of books, and music evenings, where I answered only to myself. I had given them houses, educations, weddings, and more than enough money to build their futures. That was my duty as their mother. But no one could demand the last fragments of my soul. And so I chose solitude, not loneliness, but peace. I understood that my children's devotion was real, yet I also sensed the shadow behind it. Part of their loyalty came from love, but part of it lingered because I still held money. I had paid for every tuition bill, every college fee, every expense that carved a path for them. I bought their homes when they married. I funded their weddings without a second thought. But after that, I told myself it was enough. I had given more than most mothers ever could. I had fulfilled every duty. And still deep in my heart, I knew the scars of my past life had not vanished. I had set them down, but I had never forgotten. So I decided to live separately, each of us on our own paths. Peaceful distance was the best conclusion. For my old age, the National Aerospace Research Institute made arrangements long before I ever asked. They secured me a place in a private retirement community, one of the finest in Texas. There were nurses around the clock, every comfort within reach. Gardens, libraries, art studios, even a travel program for those of us who still had the strength to wander. If I wanted to cross the country to see the mountains of Colorado or the canyons of Arizona, nothing stood in my way. I had the health and the wealth to do it. The only thing I could not control was the persistence of my family. Ever since I moved into that elegant home for the aged, my son and daughter took turns bringing their families to visit. Week after week, they arrived with toddlers in tow, my grandchildren filling the halls with laughter. Their voices rang out, "Grandma, Grandma," echoing like bells in a place that otherwise might have been too quiet. With my children there remained a faint wall, a subtle distance I did not try to cross. But with the little ones, I held no resentment. They were innocent. If they came, I welcomed them with joy. If they stayed away, I never called to ask why. One weekend, both of my children arrived together, their spouses and children, carrying a large two-tiered birthday cake. Candles glowed as the staff and my grandchildren sang. I smiled, clapping gently as the little ones sang off-key, with their sticky hands raised toward me. For a moment, I felt almost light, almost free. Then I noticed the look on my son's face. His phone vibrated, and I saw his expression change. My instincts sharpened. "What is it, son?" I asked. He forced a smile and shook his head. "Nothing, Mom. Make a wish." He silenced the phone and urged me to blow out the candles. Later, I learned the truth. That call had come from the hospital. George Carter had collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage. He had been rushed into emergency care. But my son chose to keep it from me, at least until the celebration ended. He let me enjoy my birthday in peace, only afterward, hurrying to the hospital. By then it was too late. George was already gone. All his life he had earned so little, saved so little. That one brief stay in the ICU drained every last cent of his pension. My children even had to spend more than $10,000 of their own to cover the rest. And so after a lifetime of believing himself grand, he was laid to rest in the cheapest way possible. 3 days later, his coffin was lowered into the ground in a small cemetery. My children asked if I wanted to go, if I wanted to stand by the grave one final time. I only shook my head. In my heart, George Carter had died decades earlier on the day I walked away with my suitcase in hand. The man who had betrayed me, abandoned me, and left me to rot in silence, he had died to me then. What remained now was only a husk, a body emptied of any claim on me. After the burial, my son handed me an envelope. His voice was gentle, almost reluctant. Mom, this is a letter Dad asked us to give you. When he left, I sat in my quiet room staring at the sealed paper. My hands tightened, then loosened. I could have torn it open, searched for words of regret, perhaps even love. But what use would that be now? I laughed, a low sound that surprised even me. Then, as I rose, I tossed the letter into the trash, without ever breaking the seal. Because life is short, 100 years at best. Too short to let old poison linger. The truth is simple, the letters we receive are few, but the ones we lose pile endlessly high. Sorrows outweigh joys, and pain outweighs happiness. But in the end, none of that matters. What matters is the choice we make, how we decide to live, and whom we decide to love. And I chose myself. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.